The Irish lass, who traded her petticoats for cutlass and pistol, would carve her name into Caribbean legend with blood, steel, and the kind of defiant fury that made hardened pirates weep with admiration. Picture, if you will, the windswept shores of Cork County in the dying years of the 17th century, where the Atlantic crashes against Irish stone with the persistence of ancient memory. Here, in the shadow of Kinsale's harbor walls, a scandal was brewing that would ultimately birth one of history's most notorious pirates. The year was 1697, or perhaps 1698. Record-keeping in those tumultuous times was as fluid as the tide's end. In a modest household where propriety was supposed to reign supreme, passion was writing its own rules. William Cormac was a man caught between worlds, a successful lawyer who understood the letter of the law, but found himself helpless before the law of desire. His wife maintained their respectable household with the cold precision of social expectation, while downstairs, in the servants' quarters, Mary Brennan moved through her daily duties with the quiet grace of a woman who knew her place in the world's hierarchy. But attraction recognizes no boundaries of class or convention, and when their eyes met across the carefully ordered spaces of that Irish home, something ignited that would burn down everything they both thought they knew about their lives. The affair, when it was finally discovered, exploded through Cork society like cannon shot through a ship's hull. Mrs. Cormac, faced with the ultimate betrayal of her marriage and social position, made the choice that countless women of her era had made. She gathered what remained of her dignity and departed, leaving her husband to face the consequences of his actions. But William Cormac was made of different stuff than most men who found themselves in such circumstances. Rather than abandoning his pregnant mistress to the tender mercies of a society that showed no tolerance for fallen women, he made a decision that would define not only his future, but the extraordinary life of the child who would soon enter the world. He moved Mary Brennan into his house as his common-law wife, transforming scandal into something approaching respectability through the simple expedient of refusing to acknowledge that anything scandalous had occurred. It was a brazen move that required considerable courage and an even more considerable disregard for social opinion. The people of Cork might whisper and point, but William Cormac had chosen love over convention, and he would live with the consequences. Into this atmosphere of defiant unconventionality was born Anne Cormac, though the world would come to know her by a different name entirely. From her first breath, she was marked by the circumstances of her birth, not with shame as society intended, but with something far more dangerous: the understanding that rules were made by people and could therefore be broken by people with sufficient will and courage. Her early years unfolded in an Ireland that was itself caught between worlds. The old Gaelic culture was giving way to English dominance, while the Catholic majority chafed under Protestant rule. It was a land of contradictions and tensions, where ancient loyalties battled modern realities, and where a quick wit and quicker temper were often the difference between survival and destruction. Young Anne absorbed these lessons with the intuitive understanding of a child who had been born outside conventional boundaries. The scandal that surrounded her birth never entirely faded, despite her father's efforts to normalize their situation. Neighbors might be polite to William Cormac's face. He was, after all, a successful lawyer with influence in the community, but their children were less diplomatic. Anne learned early that words could cut as deeply as knives, and she developed a thick skin and sharp tongue that would serve her well in the years to come. But it was not just the social challenges that shaped her character. William Cormac, perhaps recognizing that his daughter would need every advantage he could give her, treated her more like a son than a daughter. He taught her to read and write at a time when many women remained illiterate throughout their lives. He included her in discussions of business and law, sharing with her the masculine world of commerce and conflict that was normally forbidden to females. Most significantly, he never taught her the subtle arts of submission and deference that were considered essential to feminine virtue. The result was a young woman who possessed not only intelligence and education, but something far more dangerous: the absolute conviction that she was the equal of any man she might encounter. This was not mere arrogance, though Anne possessed that quality in abundance, but a fundamental worldview that had been shaped by her father's treatment and reinforced by her daily experiences. She had grown up in a household where a woman's voice carried weight, where feminine opinion was not only tolerated but actively sought. But Ireland, for all its wild beauty and cultural richness, was proving insufficient to contain William Cormac's ambitions. The legal profession in Cork, while respectable, offered limited opportunities for a man whose personal circumstances had placed him somewhat outside respectable society. Stories reached him of the opportunities available in the New World, where men of talent and ambition could build fortunes that would have been impossible in the rigid social hierarchies of the old country. The American colonies in the early years of the 18th century were experiencing explosive growth. Tobacco cultivation in Virginia and the Carolinas was generating unprecedented wealth, while the sugar islands of the Caribbean promised even greater riches for those bold enough to seize them. Men with legal training were desperately needed to handle the complex commercial transactions that were transforming the colonial economy from subsistence farming to global commerce. So William Cormac made another of those decisions that would define his family's destiny. He would transplant his small household to the Carolina colony, where a man's past mattered less than his present abilities and future potential. It was a move that required considerable courage. The Atlantic crossing was perilous, the colonial settlements primitive by European standards, and success was far from guaranteed. But it was also an opportunity to escape the social constraints that had limited their lives in Ireland, and to create new identities in a land where reinvention was not only possible but encouraged. The voyage across the Atlantic in the early years of the 18th century was an ordeal that separated the truly determined from the merely hopeful. Ships of that era were cramped, unsanitary, and at the mercy of weather patterns that could turn deadly without warning. Disease spread rapidly through the confined quarters, while storms could send passengers and cargo sliding helplessly across tilting decks. Many who survived the crossing arrived in the New World weakened by illness and privation, grateful simply to have reached their destination alive. But Anne Cormac, now calling herself Anne Bonny after her father's decision to adopt a new surname as insurance against any lingering Irish scandals, emerged from the crossing with her spirit not only intact but somehow enhanced by the experience. The months at sea had given her a taste of life beyond the constraints of land-based society, where the normal rules of behavior were suspended in favor of more immediate concerns like survival and cooperation. She had watched the sailors at their work, noting their easy camaraderie and casual acceptance of danger. She had observed the way authority functioned aboard ship, where competence mattered more than birth and where even the humblest crew member could rise to positions of responsibility through demonstrated skill. Most importantly, she had felt the intoxicating freedom that came with being beyond the reach of traditional society, where a woman might dress and act as she pleased without fear of social retribution. The Carolina colony that greeted the Cormac family was a raw, vital place where fortunes were made and lost with breathtaking speed. Charleston was emerging as one of the most important ports in North America, its harbor filled with ships carrying rice, tobacco, and indigo to markets in Europe and the Caribbean. The surrounding countryside was being transformed by plantation agriculture, while the coastal waters swarmed with merchants, fishermen, and the occasional pirate seeking to supplement their income through less conventional means. William Cormac quickly established himself as one of Charleston's more successful lawyers, his Irish charm and genuine legal ability making him popular with the merchant community that formed the colony's economic backbone. The family's past became irrelevant in a society that judged people primarily by their present contributions and future potential. Within a few years, they had achieved the respectability that had eluded them in Ireland, complete with a substantial house, profitable legal practice, and acceptance into Charleston's emerging social elite. But respectability, Anne was discovering, came with its own set of constraints. The young woman, who had grown up thinking of herself as her father's intellectual equal, was now expected to transform herself into a proper colonial lady, demure, obedient, and focused entirely on the domestic arts. The transformation might have worked with a different sort of young woman, But Bonny was not the malleable material from which proper ladies were typically fashioned. She had tasted too much freedom, absorbed too much unconventional thinking, and developed too strong a sense of her own worth to submit gracefully to society's expectations. The result was a constant tension between her family's social aspirations and her own increasingly rebellious nature. The tension exploded into open conflict when Anne reached her late teens and her father began entertaining serious discussions about her marriage prospects. Charleston's eligible bachelors were a mixed lot. Some were genuinely attractive prospects who could offer security and social advancement, while others were fortune hunters, drawn by William Cormac's growing wealth. But from Anne's perspective, they all shared one fatal flaw. They expected her to surrender her independence in exchange for their protection and support. The young men who came calling found themselves facing a woman unlike any they had previously encountered. Anne was beautiful, that much was undeniable, with the kind of vivid coloring and dramatic features that caught the eye and held it. Her Irish heritage had given her auburn hair that caught fire in sunlight and green eyes that could shift from laughter to fury in an instant. But her beauty was matched by an intelligence and force of personality that most colonial gentlemen found deeply unsettling. She asked questions that proper young ladies were not supposed to ask, expressed opinions on topics that were supposedly beyond feminine understanding, and worst of all, she seemed genuinely unimpressed by the social and economic advantages that marriage to them would provide. Where they expected deference, she offered challenge. Where they sought submission, she demonstrated independence. It was as if she had never learned the fundamental lesson that all colonial women were supposed to absorb, that their value lay in their ability to enhance masculine achievement rather than pursuing achievement in their own right. The situation reached crisis point when Anne was in her early 20s, and her father arranged what he considered an ideal match with a young plantation owner whose family connections and economic prospects made him exactly the sort of son-in-law that would consolidate the Cormac family's social position. The young man was handsome enough, intelligent enough, and wealthy enough to satisfy any reasonable woman's expectations. His only flaw, from Anne's perspective, was that he bored her to tears. The courtship, such as it was, proceeded with all the passion of a business negotiation, which in many ways it resembled. Both families understood the advantages that would accrue from the union. The Cormacs would gain access to established plantation society, while the prospective groom's family would benefit from William Cormac's legal expertise and growing political influence. It was the sort of arrangement that had been cementing elite families together for generations. And there was no reason to expect that this particular negotiation would end any differently than countless others. But Anne Bonny had different ideas about her future, and she was not about to surrender her independence to satisfy anyone else's social ambitions. The young woman who had grown up believing herself the equal of any man was not prepared to spend the rest of her life managing domestic affairs while her husband made the decisions that would determine their mutual destiny. She wanted adventure, excitement, and the kind of freedom that colonial society reserved exclusively for men. The opportunity for escape came in the form of James Bonny, a sailor with more charm than prospects and more dreams than common sense. James was everything that Anne's respectable suitor was not: dangerous, unpredictable, and completely unsuitable by conventional standards. He had sailed throughout the Caribbean, fought in several naval actions, and possessed the kind of casual courage that came from facing death on a regular basis. Most importantly, he seemed to recognize and appreciate Anne's unconventional nature, rather than trying to suppress it. Their courtship was brief, passionate, and conducted largely in secret. James understood that he had no chance of winning William Cormac's approval for a match that offered no social or economic advantages to the family, and understood that her father would never consent to a marriage to a penniless sailor when far more advantageous matches were available. But both understood that sometimes love demanded choices that couldn't be justified by conventional logic. The elopement, when it finally occurred, sent shockwaves through Charleston's respectable society. Anne Cormac, who had been destined for marriage to one of the colony's most eligible bachelors, had instead run off with a sailor of no particular family or fortune. The scandal was everything that William Cormac had worked so hard to avoid, a return to the kind of social embarrassment that had driven him from Ireland decades earlier. His response was swift and decisive. Anne was cut off from the family fortune and forbidden from using the Cormac name. If she wanted to throw away her opportunities for the sake of an unsuitable marriage, she would do so without any support from the family she was disgracing. It was a harsh decision, but one that reflected both his genuine anger at her disobedience and his calculation that complete rejection might shock her into reconsidering her choices. But Anne Bonny, for she now bore her husband's name, was not the sort of woman who could be easily shocked into submission. Her father's rejection hurt, but it also liberated her from the last constraints of respectable society. If she was going to be treated as an outcast anyway, she might as well embrace the freedom that came with her new status. James Bonny's solution to their financial difficulties was to relocate to Nassau in the Bahamas, where opportunities supposedly awaited any man willing to work hard and take reasonable risks. Nassau, in the early 18th century, was a place where such opportunities definitely existed, though they were not necessarily the sort that respectable society would have endorsed. The Bahamas had become a haven for ex-privateers who had found themselves unemployed when the War of the Spanish Succession ended in 1713. Men who had spent years attacking Spanish shipping under royal commission were not easily convinced to return to mundane civilian occupations, and many had simply continued their maritime careers without bothering to secure proper authorization. Nassau provided them with a base of operations that was technically under British authority, but practically beyond effective government control. When Anne and James Bonny arrived in Nassau around 1718, they found a community unlike anything that existed elsewhere in the civilized world. Here was a place where a man's past mattered less than his present abilities, where social hierarchy was determined by courage and competence, rather than birth and wealth, and where the normal rules of behavior were suspended in favor of more immediate concerns like survival and mutual protection. The island swarmed with characters who would have been imprisoned or hanged in more conventional communities. Ex-privateers rubbed shoulders with escaped slaves, failed planters drank with successful pirates, and women who had abandoned respectable society for various reasons found themselves accepted as the equals of men who had made similar choices. It was a rough, violent, dangerous place, but it was also vibrantly alive in ways that more civilized communities could never match. Anne found herself fascinated by this new world and its inhabitants. For the first time in her life, she was surrounded by people who had consciously chosen freedom over security, adventure over comfort, and independence over social acceptance. These were not people who had fallen into unconventional lives through weakness or desperation, but individuals who had deliberately rejected the constraints of ordinary society in favor of something more exciting and personally fulfilling. The most fascinating inhabitants of this maritime community were the pirates themselves. These were not the desperate criminals of popular imagination, but skilled professionals who had made calculated decisions about how they wanted to live their lives. Many were former naval officers with extensive maritime experience, while others were ex-privateers who possessed both the ships and crews necessary for successful piratical enterprises. Among the most charismatic of these figures was John Rackham, known throughout the Caribbean as Calico Jack, for his preference for brightly colored clothing that announced his presence from considerable distances. Rackham was everything that James Bonny was not: successful, confident, and possessed of the kind of natural leadership that attracted followers without effort. He commanded his own vessel, controlled a substantial crew, and had established himself as one of Nassau's more prosperous residents through a combination of luck, skill, and ruthless determination. Anne met him at one of the taverns that served as Nassau's social centers, places where pirates, merchants, fishermen, and assorted adventurers gathered to exchange information, negotiate deals, and enjoy the kind of entertainment that was available nowhere else in the civilized world. The attraction between them was immediate and mutual to strong personalities, recognizing something complementary in each other. Rackham saw in Anne Bonny a woman unlike any he had previously encountered. beautiful but not fragile, intelligent but not constrained by conventional thinking, passionate but not submissive. She possessed the kind of fierce independence that he valued in his crew members, combined with a personal magnetism that could prove invaluable in the complex social relationships that governed pirate society. Anne saw in Calico Jack everything that her respectable colonial suitors had lacked: genuine courage, proven competence, and the absolute freedom that came with commanding his own destiny. Here was a man who had carved out his own place in the world through personal merit, rather than inherited advantage, who answered to no authority save his own judgment, and who seemed genuinely intrigued by, rather than threatened by, her unconventional nature. Their affair began almost immediately, conducted with the kind of passionate intensity that reflected their mutual understanding that life was uncertain and opportunities fleeting. In the conventional world they had both abandoned, such behavior would have been scandalous beyond redemption. In Nassau's maritime community, it was simply another example of people following their desires without regard for social conventions that held no authority in their chosen environment. James Bonny's response to his wife's infidelity revealed the fundamental weakness that had made him unsuitable for the world he had chosen to inhabit. Rather than challenging Rackham directly, which would have been dangerous but would have earned him some respect, or accepting the situation with dignified resignation, he chose instead to appeal to the authorities for redress. In a community where personal disputes were normally settled through personal confrontation, such an appeal to outside authority marked him as fundamentally unsuited for the rough democracy of pirate society. His petition to Governor Woodes Rogers, who had recently been appointed to restore royal authority in the Bahamas, requested that Anne be returned to his custody as his lawful wife. It was a legally sound request that demonstrated his understanding of marriage law, but it also revealed his complete failure to understand the woman he had married, or the community they were now part of. Rogers, for his part, faced a delicate situation that illustrated the complexities of governing a community where legal authority and practical power often diverged. He had been sent to Nassau with a mandate to suppress piracy and restore conventional order, but he also understood that success would require the cooperation of men who had little reason to respect traditional authority. Alienating influential pirates like Rackham over domestic disputes could undermine his larger mission of pacifying the Bahamas. The governor's solution was characteristically pragmatic. He offered to uphold James Bonny's legal rights, if the man could find some way to enforce them personally. It was a response that effectively placed the burden of action back on the wronged husband, while avoiding any official commitment that might prove difficult to fulfill. But by this time, Anne had made her own decision about her future, and it had nothing to do with either her legal husband or the governor's attempts to restore conventional morality to Nassau. She had found in Calico Jack Rackham not just a lover, but a partner, who shared her vision of life as an adventure to be embraced, rather than a burden to be endured. More importantly, she had discovered in the pirate community a place where her unconventional nature was not merely tolerated, but actively valued. Her decision to formally abandon her marriage and join Rackham's crew was unprecedented in the annals of Caribbean piracy. While the pirate community had always included women as tavern keepers, merchants, and occasional lovers, it had never included women as full participants in the actual business of piracy itself. Anne Bonny was proposing to cross a boundary that had previously been considered absolute. Rackham's willingness to accept her as a full crew member, rather than merely a passenger or companion, demonstrated both his genuine affection for her and his recognition of her potential value to his enterprise. Anne possessed qualities that could enhance rather than burden his operations. Intelligence that could be useful in planning raids, courage that had been demonstrated in various Nassau confrontations, and a fierce loyalty that would make her invaluable in the dangerous situations that were an inevitable part of piratical life. Her integration into the crew required considerable adjustment on everyone's part. The men who had previously known her only as James Bonny's wife now had to accept her as a colleague and equal. She had to learn the complex skills required for successful piracy: navigation, gunnery, swordplay, and the delicate art of managing interpersonal relationships in the confined quarters of a pirate vessel. The physical demands of piratical life were considerable. Ships of that era required constant maintenance, sails had to be managed in all weather conditions, and the successful capture of prizes often required brutal hand-to-hand combat. Anne had to develop not only the technical skills necessary for these activities, but also the physical strength and endurance that would allow her to perform them effectively under the most demanding circumstances. But perhaps more challenging than the physical demands were the psychological adjustments required. Piracy was not simply theft conducted at sea, but a complex enterprise that required careful planning, detailed intelligence gathering, and the kind of ruthless decision-making that could mean the difference between success and disaster. Anne had to learn to think like a predator, to evaluate potential targets not as fellow human beings, but as sources of profit to be exploited with maximum efficiency and minimum risk. The transformation was remarkable to witness. The young woman who had grown up in respectable Charleston society gradually became a skilled practitioner of maritime violence, capable of boarding enemy vessels with cutlass in hand and pistol at her side. Her education and intelligence made her valuable in planning operations, while her courage and determination made her invaluable in executing them. But it was not just Anne who was transformed by her new career. Rackham's crew found their dynamics altered by the presence of a woman who was neither passive victim nor helpless dependent, but an active participant who expected to be treated as an equal. Some men struggled with this adjustment, while others found that Anne's presence actually enhanced crew morale and effectiveness. The success of their early operations together established Anne Bonny as more than just Calico Jack. Eslover she became recognized throughout the Caribbean pirate community as a formidable pirate in her own right. Her reputation for courage and skill grew with each successful raid, and her unconventional status as a female pirate made her something of a celebrity in the taverns and brothels where pirates gathered to spend their profits. It was during this period of growing success and notoriety that it encountered Mary Read, the other woman who would share her place in pirate legends. Mary's story was even more extraordinary than Anne's, involving a lifetime of gender deception that had allowed her to pursue careers normally reserved exclusively for men. Mary had been born into poverty and had spent her childhood disguised as a boy to help her mother obtain financial support from relatives who would have been unwilling to assist a woman with an illegitimate daughter. The deception had become so natural that Mary had maintained her masculine identity throughout her youth, eventually joining the British military and serving with distinction in several European campaigns. Her path to piracy had been more circuitous than Anne's. Mary had served aboard merchant vessels in various capacities, always maintaining her masculine disguise and always proving herself capable of handling whatever challenges her chosen profession might present. She had joined Rackham's crew as an ordinary seaman, with no one suspecting that the competent sailor they knew as Mark Reed was actually a woman. The revelation of Mary's true identity created one of those moments that illuminates the strange complexities of pirate society. Here were two women who had chosen radically different strategies for surviving in a masculine world. Anne had embraced her femininity while demanding to be treated as an equal, while Mary had abandoned femininity entirely in favor of masculine identity. Yet both had reached the same destination through their different journeys. Their friendship, when it developed, was based on mutual recognition of shared experiences and complementary strengths. Anne's fierce independence was balanced by Mary's hard-won practical skills, while Mary's lifetime of masculine disguise was complemented by Anne's refusal to be constrained by feminine expectations. Together, they formed a partnership that enhanced both their individual effectiveness and the overall capabilities of Rackham's crew. The addition of Mary Read to what was already an unconventional pirate crew created something unprecedented in Caribbean maritime history. a vessel where women served not just as passengers or ornaments, but as full participants in every aspect of piratical enterprise. It was a development that challenged fundamental assumptions about gender roles and capabilities, while demonstrating that courage and competence were not exclusively masculine virtues. Their operations during the spring and summer of 1720 established them as one of the most successful pirate crews operating in Caribbean waters. They captured numerous vessels, accumulated substantial treasure, and developed a reputation for both effectiveness and relative restraint in their treatment of prisoners. Unlike some pirate crews that were known for gratuitous violence, Rackham's crew generally focused on profit rather than sadistic entertainment. Anne and Mary's contributions to these successes were substantial and recognized by their fellow crew members. Both women proved themselves capable of the kind of brutal hand-to-hand combat that was often necessary to subdue resistant crews. While their intelligence and planning abilities made them valuable in developing strategies for successful raids, but their greatest contribution may have been psychological. The sight of women fighting alongside men with equal ferocity and skill had a devastating effect on the morale of their opponents. Merchant sailors, who might have been willing to resist male pirates, found their courage failing when faced with the unprecedented spectacle of armed women, who seemed to relish combat as much as their masculine colleagues. The psychological advantage extended beyond combat situations. The stories that spread throughout the Caribbean about Calico Jack's crew and their female members enhanced their reputation far beyond what their actual operations might have warranted. They became larger-than-life figures whose mere presence in an area was enough to alter shipping patterns and send nervous merchants seeking alternative routes. This period of success, however, contained the seeds of their eventual downfall. The very notoriety that made them effective also made them targets for increasingly determined efforts at suppression. Colonial authorities, who might have tolerated ordinary piracy, could not ignore the spectacular challenge to social order represented by successful female pirates. Moreover, their success had made them wealthy enough to afford the kind of relaxed lifestyle that often proved fatal to pirate crews. The discipline and vigilance that had made them effective began to erode, as they spent more time celebrating their victories and less time preparing for future challenges. It was a pattern that had destroyed many successful pirate crews, and Rackham's followers were proving no more immune to its dangers than their predecessors. The beginning of the end came in October 1720, when Captain Jonathan Barnett, commanding a sloop commissioned by the governor of Jamaica to hunt pirates, encountered Rackham's vessel near Negril Point. Barnett had been tracking the pirates for several days, using intelligence from captured crew members and cooperative merchants to narrow his search. The encounter might have ended differently if Rackham's crew had been at full readiness, but they had been celebrating a recent capture and were in no condition for serious combat. Most of the men were drunk, while others were simply unprepared for the kind of determined assault that Barnett's well-trained crew was capable of mounting. Only Anne, Bonny, and Mary Reed seemed capable of offering effective resistance, while their male colleagues stumbled about in various states of intoxication. The two women fought with a kind of desperate fury that comes from understanding that capture would mean certain death. They held off Barnett's boarding party for as long as possible, but even their fierce resistance could not compensate for the complete failure of their companions. The capture was swift and decisive. Within hours, the crew that had terrorized Caribbean shipping for months found themselves in chains, bound for Spanish Town, and the kind of legal proceedings that invariably ended with death sentences for convicted pirates. The trials that followed were among the most spectacular in the legal history of the Caribbean. The prospect of seeing notorious pirates brought to justice always drew large crowds, but the inclusion of two female defendants made these proceedings unprecedented. Colonial society had never before witnessed the spectacle of women standing trial for piracy, and public interest was intense. The first trial for the pirates was held in St. Iago de la Vega, in Jamaica, on November 16, 1720. The trials were led by Sir Nicholas Laws in an English court of admiralty. The proceedings were conducted with all the formality that British colonial justice could muster. But the outcome was never in doubt. The evidence of piracy was overwhelming. The defendants had been captured in arms, and colonial law provided no alternative to death sentences for convicted pirates. During the first trial, Rackham and 8 of his fellow pirates were found guilty and sentenced to death. Calico Jack faced his fate with the kind of resigned courage that was expected of pirates. But his primary concern seemed to be obtaining permission to see Anne one final time before his execution. Their final meeting was brief and conducted under heavy guard, but it provided Anne with the opportunity to deliver what would become one of the most famous declarations in pirate history. When Rackham expressed regret about their situation and his love for her, Anne's response was characteristically direct. She told him that if he had fought like a man, he would not be dying like a dog. It was a harsh judgment on the man who had given her the opportunity to live as she chose. But it also reflected Anne's fundamental understanding that the pirate life demanded absolute commitment to its values. Courage was the coin of the realm in their chosen world, and any failure of courage was a betrayal of everything they had chosen to represent. Anne, Bonny, and Mary Read were tried separately, and like Rackham, the trial was short and the verdict inevitable. After calling 3 witnesses and a brief period of discussion, Governor Laws found Bonny and Read guilty of piracy and sentenced them both to be hanged. But the 2 women had one final card to play. Both women escaped their sentence because each was pregnant. Under British law, pregnant women could not be executed until after they had given birth, and this legal protection provided them with at least a temporary reprieve from the gallows. The pregnancy defense was not uncommon in cases involving female criminals, but it had never before been used by convicted pirates. The spectacle of 2 pregnant women who had been living as pirates challenged every assumption that colonial society held about feminine nature and maternal instinct. Here were women who had chosen violence and adventure over domestic tranquility, who had risked not only their own lives, but those of their unborn children in pursuit of the kind of freedom that was supposedly beyond feminine understanding. Mary Read would never have the opportunity to test whether her pregnancy might have led to eventual freedom. She died in prison, probably from fever, before her child could be born. Her death removed from the world one of the most remarkable individuals of her generation, a woman who had successfully maintained masculine identity for decades and had proven herself the equal of any man in courage, skill, and determination. Anne Bonny's fate was more mysterious and has remained one of the enduring puzzles of pirate history. Recent historical research suggests that she had sufficient influence to obtain her rapid release and return to Charlestown, South Carolina, where she gave birth to Rackham's second child. On the 21st of December, 1721, she married a local man, Joseph Burleigh, had 8 more children, and became a respectable woman. She lived on in South Carolina to the age of 84 and was buried there on the 25th of April, 1782. If this account is accurate, it means that Anne Bonny managed to achieve something that few convicted pirates ever accomplished. She escaped execution and lived to enjoy a long and apparently prosperous life. The young woman who had scandalized Charleston society by eloping with a penniless sailor, who had then scandalized the entire Caribbean by becoming a successful pirate, ultimately returned to the kind of respectable domestic life that she had once rejected so dramatically. The transformation from notorious pirate to respectable matron was remarkable enough, but even more remarkable was her apparent success in maintaining her new identity. Colonial society, which had such rigid standards for feminine behavior, somehow accepted the return of a woman who had violated every conceivable norm of proper conduct. Her ability to reintegrate into respectable society suggests either extraordinary personal charm or influential connections that could smooth over past indiscretions. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of her later life was the question of what happened to the fierce independence and love of adventure that had driven her to piracy in the first place. Did marriage and motherhood satisfy needs that had previously required the excitement of maritime violence? Did she find in domestic responsibilities the kind of challenge and fulfillment that had once required cutlass and pistol? Or did she simply make a calculated decision that survival required adaptation? that the age of Caribbean piracy was ending and that wise individuals would find new ways to express their unconventional natures. The woman who had shown such strategic thinking in her piratical career might well have applied the same calculating intelligence to the challenge of building a new life in changed circumstances. The historical record provides no answers to these questions, leaving us to speculate about the inner life of a woman who had proven herself capable of extraordinary transformations. The Bonny, who lived quietly in South Carolina for 6 decades, remains as mysterious as the Bonny who terrorized Caribbean shipping for a few brief months. What is certain is that her story had an impact far beyond her personal circumstances. The tale of the Irish lass who became a Caribbean pirate entered folklore almost immediately, inspiring countless retellings that emphasized different aspects of her remarkable career. Some versions portrayed her as a romantic figure whose love for Calico Jack had led her to adventure and danger. Others emphasized her courage and skill as a warrior who had proven that women could excel in traditionally masculine pursuits. The story evolved with each retelling, accumulating details that may or may not have been historically accurate but that reflected the storyteller's understanding of what made Bonny's tale compelling. She became larger than life in the way that only legendary figures can, representing not just her own extraordinary choices, but the eternal human dream of breaking free from social constraints and living life on one's own terms. Her influence on popular culture has been enormous and enduring, from Daniel Defoe's early accounts through modern novels and films. Bonny has served as the template for countless fictional female pirates and adventurers. Her story demonstrated that women could be protagonists in tales of adventure and violence, that feminine characters need not be confined to roles as victims or prizes to be won by masculine heroes. The feminist movement of the 20th century found in Bonny a historical precedent for their arguments about female capability and independence. Here was a woman who had refused to accept the limitations that society attempted to impose upon her, who had carved out her own destiny through courage and determination, and who had proven herself capable of excelling in pursuits that were supposedly beyond feminine capacity. But Bonny's legacy transcends simple feminist interpretation. Her story speaks to something more fundamental about human nature and the eternal tension between individual freedom and social order. She represents the part of every person that chafes against authority, that dreams of escaping the suffocating embrace of respectability and social expectation, that yearns for the kind of absolute freedom that can only be found beyond the boundaries of civilized society. The circumstances that made her career possible, the chaos of post-war colonial society, the weakness of governmental authority in remote maritime regions, the opportunities created by global commerce were unique to her historical moment. The age of Caribbean piracy was brief, lasting only a few decades before improved naval patrols and more effective colonial administration made such careers impossible. Yet the appeal of her story has proven timeless, because it addresses needs and desires that transcend any particular historical period. In every generation, there are individuals who find themselves constrained by the expectations and limitations of their society, who dream of breaking free from conventional paths to pursue something more exciting and personally fulfilling. Bonny's greatest achievement may have been demonstrating that such dreams were not merely fantasies but achievable realities for those bold enough to pursue them and strong enough to pay their price. She proved that even the most rigid social boundaries could be crossed by individuals with sufficient determination, that gender roles were not immutable laws of nature, but human constructions that could be challenged and overcome. The price she paid for her freedom was considerable: social ostracism, physical danger, the loss of family connections, and ultimately, the constant threat of violent death. The life she chose was brutal, uncertain, and morally questionable by any conventional standard. She lived by violence and the threat of violence, accumulated wealth through theft and intimidation, and belonged to a community that existed in permanent defiance of legal authority. Yet, within those constraints, she achieved something that few people of any era have managed: She lived entirely according to her own choices and values. She refused to accept the role that society had prepared for her, carved out her own space in a world that insisted such spaces did not exist for women, and proved herself capable of succeeding in pursuits that were supposedly beyond feminine capacity. Her relationship with Calico Jack Rackham, while it ended tragically, represented something unprecedented in the annals of maritime adventure. Here was a partnership between equals, to individuals who had chosen similar paths and who supported each other's unconventional ambitions. It was not the traditional relationship between masculine protector and feminine dependent, but a collaboration between two strong personalities who enhanced each other's capabilities. The friendship she developed with Mary Read was equally remarkable and perhaps even more significant. Their bond was forged not just by shared danger and mutual respect, but by the recognition that they were both pioneers in territories that had never before been explored by women. They were creating new possibilities for feminine identity and achievement, proving that women could succeed in traditionally masculine pursuits without sacrificing their essential humanity. Their courage in combat became legendary throughout the Caribbean, but their greater courage lay in their willingness to challenge fundamental assumptions about what women could and should be. They lived at a time when feminine virtue was defined by submission, obedience, and domestic focus. Yet they demonstrated that women could be independent, aggressive, and successful in pursuits that required traditionally masculine qualities. The trial that ended their piratical careers was significant not just for its legal outcomes, but for what it revealed about colonial society's struggle to comprehend women who had stepped so far outside conventional roles. The legal system was equipped to deal with male pirates. They were criminals who could be tried, convicted, and executed according to established procedures. But female pirates presented unprecedented challenges that exposed the limitations of existing legal and social frameworks. The spectacle of two women standing trial for piracy challenged every assumption that colonial society held about feminine nature. How could creatures who were supposedly inherently peaceful and nurturing have participated in acts of maritime violence? How could beings who were supposedly naturally submissive have taken leadership roles in criminal enterprises? The questions were uncomfortable because they suggested that conventional understanding of gender differences might be based more on social convention than natural law. And Bonny's final declaration to Calico Jack before his execution, that if he had fought like a man, he would not be dying like a dog, revealed the extent to which she had internalized the values of pirate society. She judged him not by the standards of conventional morality, but by the harsh code that governed their chosen world, where courage was the ultimate virtue and cowardice the unforgivable sin. It was a brutal judgment that reflected the brutal realities of the life they had chosen together. In the pirate world, survival depended on the willingness to fight against overwhelming odds, to face death without flinching, and to maintain one's honor even in the face of inevitable defeat. Rackham's failure to meet these standards, regardless of his other qualities, marked him as unworthy of the respect that pirate society reserved for those who lived and died according to its uncompromising code. The mystery surrounding Anne Bonny's ultimate fate adds another layer to her legend. If she did indeed return to South Carolina and live out her days as a respectable matron, the transformation represents one of the most remarkable reinventions in colonial American history. The woman who had once terrorized Caribbean shipping somehow managed to integrate herself back into the kind of society she had once rejected so dramatically. Such a transformation would have required extraordinary adaptability and probably considerable help from influential connections. Colonial society was not known for its forgiveness of past transgressions, particularly when those transgressions had been as public and spectacular as Anne Bonny's piratical career. Her successful reintegration suggests either that her family connections were more powerful than historical records indicate, or that her personal charm was sufficient to overcome social prejudices that had proven insurmountable for others. The possibility that she lived to old age in comfortable respectability raises fascinating questions about the relationship between individual personality and social circumstances. Was the fierce independence that had driven her to piracy simply a response to the limitations she had faced as a young woman. Once those limitations were removed by wealth, by age, by changed social circumstances, did she no longer need the kind of dramatic rebellion that had defined her youth? Or did she find in marriage and motherhood the kind of challenge and fulfillment that had once required cutlass and pistol? The woman who had proven herself capable of leadership in the most demanding circumstances might well have discovered that managing a household and raising children provided sufficient scope for her considerable abilities. The alternative possibility that she never escaped her piratical past but died young in some unknown location is perhaps more romantically satisfying, but ultimately less interesting. The Bonny who died as she had lived in defiance of authority and in pursuit of absolute freedom makes for better dramatic material, but tells us less about the complexities of human nature and the possibility of radical personal transformation. Whatever her ultimate fate, Bonny's historical significance extends far beyond the brief period of her piratical career. She represents a crucial moment in the evolution of ideas about gender and capability, when individual courage and determination proved capable of overcoming social constraints that had previously seemed absolute and unchangeable. Her story demonstrates that even the most rigid social boundaries are ultimately human constructions that can be challenged and overcome by individuals with sufficient will and courage. The limitations that society attempted to impose upon her as a woman, as the daughter of scandalous parents, as someone outside the conventional structures of respectability, proved insufficient to contain her ambitions or constrain her choices. The world that made her career possible was violent, chaotic, and morally ambiguous, but it was also vibrantly alive in ways that more conventional societies could never match. The Caribbean of the early 18th century offered opportunities for individual achievement and personal freedom that would have been impossible in more settled and regulated environments. It was a place where merit mattered more than birth, where courage could overcome social disadvantage, and where unconventional individuals could find communities that valued their unique contributions. Bonny's ability to thrive in this environment speaks to qualities that transcend gender: intelligence, courage, adaptability, and the kind of fierce determination that refuses to accept defeat. She succeeded not because she was a woman in a man's world, but because she possessed the personal qualities that success required, and the wisdom to recognize and seize the opportunities that her historical moment provided. Her influence on subsequent generations has been profound and enduring. The story of the Irish lass who became a Caribbean pirate has inspired countless retellings, each emphasizing different aspects of her remarkable career. Some focus on the romantic elements of her relationship with Calico Jack, others on her friendship with Mary Read, still others on her courage in combat and her defiance of authority. These various interpretations reflect the richness of her story and its capacity to speak to different audiences and different concerns. She can be seen as a romantic heroine whose love led her to adventure, as a feminist pioneer who proved that women could succeed in traditionally masculine pursuits, or as a rebel who refused to accept the limitations that society attempted to impose upon her. But perhaps most significantly, she represents the eternal human dream of absolute freedom, the possibility of living entirely according to one's own choices and values, without regard for social expectations or conventional limitations. It is a dream that has appealed to every generation, though few have possessed the courage and determination necessary to pursue it as relentlessly as Bonny did. The price of such freedom, as her story demonstrates, is invariably high. Those who choose to live beyond the boundaries of conventional society must be prepared to face violence, uncertainty, and moral ambiguity as constant companions. They must be willing to sacrifice the security and comfort that come with social acceptance in exchange for the intoxicating but dangerous freedom that exists only in the spaces between established authorities. Bonny was willing to pay that price, and her willingness transformed her from a respectable colonial lady into one of history's most compelling figures. She proved that individual will could triumph over social constraint, that personal courage could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, and that even the most rigid boundaries could be crossed by those bold enough to attempt the crossing. Her legacy lives on not just in the stories that continue to be told about her, but in the expanded possibilities that her example created for subsequent generations of women. Every woman who has refused to accept traditional limitations, who has pursued career paths once reserved for men, who has demanded to be treated as an equal rather than as a dependent, owes something to the precedent that Bonny established 3 centuries ago. The flames that once danced in Blackbeard's beard have long since been extinguished, but the fire that burned in Bonny's spirit continues to inspire those who refuse to accept that their dreams are impossible simply because society insists they should be. In an age of increasing conformity and social control, her story remains a powerful reminder that individual freedom is still possible for those brave enough to seize it and strong enough to defend it against all who would try to take it away.